General Harwick walked in ready to destroy a career. The clerk sat quietly, hands folded, accepting his fate, like he'd accepted 3 years of being overlooked, undervalued, passed over for promotion. Just another faceless employee the military could afford to lose. But when the general opened the man's classified file, the room went silent. Not quiet. Silent. Because some personnel records are so dangerous that even generals need clearance to read them. November 15th, 2024, 14:30, Fort Liberty Administrative Complex, Building C, Conference Room 3. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like nervous insects, casting everything in that particular shade of government beige that made bad news feel inevitable. 3 men sat around a table built for 12, the empty chairs creating an amphitheater of judgment. General Harwick had done this dance before. Budget cuts, performance reviews, the careful choreography of ending careers without admitting the system had failed anyone. The manila folders were stacked in precise order, termination papers already signed, witness statements prepared, the bureaucratic machinery of dismissal oiled and ready to function. Today's target was simple enough. Specialist Raymond Pike. 3 years of unremarkable service, a paper trail that suggested competence without excellence, the kind of soldier who filled space without commanding attention. His supervisor ratings painted a picture of mediocrity that bordered on incompetence. Reports filed late, attention to detail lacking, initiative non-existent. The kind of employee who showed up, performed minimal duties, and disappeared at closing time without leaving any lasting impression on colleagues or superiors. Pike sat with his back straight, hands resting flat on the table, eyes forward. He'd been told this was a routine administrative review, but everyone in the room knew better. The signs were written in the careful placement of documents, the presence of witnesses, the way Colonel Stevens and Major Martinez had positioned themselves like bookends around a story that was about to close. Pike had dressed in his Class A uniform, ribbons aligned with geometric precision, boots polished to mirror brightness. He looked like a man who understood that some battles were lost before they began, but who would face defeat with the same attention to detail he'd brought to 3 years of thankless assignments. The morning had started like any other for Pike. He'd arrived at the administrative building at 6:45, 15 minutes early as always, carrying a thermos of black coffee and a worn leather portfolio that contained the day's routine paperwork. He'd nodded to the security guard, swiped his access card, and walked to his cubicle in the corner of the supply management office. For 3 years, he'd occupied the same desk, filed the same reports, managed the same inventory databases that tracked everything from paper clips to vehicle maintenance schedules. His colleagues knew him as a quiet man who kept to himself, ate lunch alone in the break room, and never participated in the casual conversations that filled the spaces between official duties. He arrived early, left on time, and never volunteered for additional assignments or expressed interest in advancement opportunities. To everyone who worked with him, Raymond Pike was the epitome of a government employee who had found his level and settled into comfortable mediocrity. Still, something else was coming. General Harwick opened his briefcase with the mechanical precision of a man who had learned to treat careers like spreadsheet entries. The termination paperwork had been prepared in advance, legal language that reduced human capability to budget line items. Pike's performance evaluations painted the picture of a serviceable but unremarkable soldier, adequate technical skills, minimal leadership potential, satisfactory but uninspiring. The kind of record that made decisions easy when resources became scarce. But something nagged at the corner of Harwick's mind as he looked across the table. Pike's posture wasn't the defeated slump of a man awaiting dismissal. There was something in the way he held himself, a stillness that suggested readiness rather than resignation. His ribbons told a story of basic competency: National Defense Service Medal, Global War on Terrorism Service Medal, Army Achievement Medal, but nothing that screamed exceptional service. Yet there was something about the man himself, the way his eyes tracked movement without seeming to watch, the controlled breathing of someone who had learned to manage stress in ways that couldn't be taught in basic training. The conference room itself felt wrong for this kind of meeting. Too large, too formal, with its polished table and official portraits of military leaders staring down from the walls. Usually, terminations were handled in smaller offices, more intimate settings where the human cost of bureaucratic decisions could be managed with appropriate privacy. But Pike's case had been flagged for additional documentation, requiring witnesses and formal procedures that elevated a routine dismissal into something approaching a military tribunal. Colonel Stevens cleared his throat and began reading from the script they'd prepared. Budget constraints, organizational restructuring, the unfortunate necessity of releasing personnel who, while dedicated, didn't meet the evolving needs of modern military operations. Pike listened without reaction, his expression neutral as lake water. Major Martinez shuffled papers and avoided eye contact, the administrative equivalent of looking away while a wounded animal was put down. The words filled the room like smoke from a bureaucratic fire, obscuring the human cost of fiscal responsibility. Another incongruity stood out. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present that they were discussing Pike's future in a room where strategic decisions were normally made. This was where generals planned operations, where intelligence briefings revealed threats to national security, where classified information was routinely discussed at levels that required special clearances and sworn oaths of secrecy. Today, it was being used to end the career of a clerk whose biggest responsibility was ensuring that office supplies were properly cataloged and distributed according to regulatory requirements. Then General Harwick reached for Pike's complete personnel file. Not the summary that had been used for the initial review, a condensed version that highlighted service record, training completions, and performance metrics. This was the full file, the one that required additional clearance to access, the one that lived in secure databases rather than standard administrative systems. Harwick's aide had delivered it that morning with the casual efficiency of someone who assumed it would contain the same information, just in greater detail. Standard operating procedure for termination meetings involving personnel with any level of security clearance required review of complete records to ensure that no classified information would be compromised by the employee's departure. Most cases involved routine verification that access credentials would be properly revoked and that no sensitive materials were in the departing employee's possession. Pandemic-era SIPR-HR mirroring protocol was suspended. Need-to-know addendums weren't mirrored to budget scans. The general's fingers hesitated for just a moment on the classified cover sheet. Something about the weight of the folder felt wrong. Too thick for 3 years of routine service, too heavy for a career that was supposed to be forgettable. The standard administrative file should have contained perhaps 50 pages of documentation, enlistment papers, training certificates, performance evaluations, medical records, disciplinary actions, if any, and miscellaneous correspondence. This file felt like it contained 10 times that amount of material. But bureaucracy has its own momentum, and Harwick opened the file with the confidence of a man who believed he already knew what story it would tell. The first page looked standard enough. Raymond Pike, enlisted October 2021, assigned to administrative duties at Fort Liberty, security clearance level appropriate for his position. Birth date, social security number, emergency contact information, all the mundane details that reduced a human being to data points that could be processed by administrative systems. This was the pivot. As Harwick's eyes moved down the page, details began to emerge that hadn't appeared in the summary version. Additional training certifications in languages that most Americans had never heard of, Pashto, Dari, Arabic dialects specific to regions that weren't supposed to have American personnel. Advanced combat training completed at facilities that weren't mentioned in standard military educational programs. Medical records that referenced injuries inconsistent with administrative work. Surgical scars from shrapnel removal, documented treatment for exposure to chemical agents, psychological evaluations related to combat stress disorders. The more Harwick read, the more confused he became. Pike's medical file alone painted a picture of someone who had experienced combat situations that would leave lasting physical and psychological marks. Burns consistent with exposure to explosives. Hearing damage from prolonged exposure to gunfire. Muscle tissue damage from carrying heavy equipment over extended distances. These weren't the medical issues of someone who spent 3 years filing reports in an air-conditioned office building. And then, buried in the middle of what should have been routine medical documentation, Harwick found a notation that made his blood pressure spike. See attached classified addendum. Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility, SCIF. Access required for review of operational medical records. The SCIF requirement meant that Pike's complete medical history was classified at levels that required presidential approval to access. Clerks didn't have medical records that required SCIF review. Harwick looked up at Pike, who hadn't moved. The man's expression remained neutral, but something had shifted in his posture. Not fear, not anticipation, but the subtle adjustment of someone who knew the moment of truth was approaching. Stevens and Martinez continued their paperwork ballet, unaware that the script was about to change in ways they couldn't imagine. They were still operating under the assumption that they were terminating a clerk whose biggest responsibility was tracking office supply inventories. The classified addendum began with a cover page that required Harwick to verify his clearance level before proceeding. As a general, he had access to most information within his operational area, but this particular file demanded verification codes he hadn't used in months. The bureaucratic equivalent of a warning label that read, "Contents may fundamentally alter your understanding of reality and require immediate consultation with higher authorities." The addendum went further. What Harwick found in the classified section wasn't a personnel record. It was an operational archive that read like classified fiction. Operation Nightfall, conducted in Afghanistan. March 2019. Classification level so high it required presidential approval to access. The primary operator was listed as Agent Blackbird, real name redacted for security purposes, mission status, successful extraction of high-value intelligence asset under extreme hostile conditions, 17 enemy combatants neutralized without alerting command structure, 0 friendly casualties, operation completed in 72 hours with no external support. As the late afternoon call to prayer rose, shadows stretched across the inner courtyard. Pike muted the door hinge with a strip of paper. In the third room, he counted the prisoners' breaths. On the way out, nettle and cordite mingled in the creek bed. He shouldered the man and passed 3 sentries, counting the faint click of each safety. The operation had been so sensitive that only 12 people in the entire military intelligence complex knew it had happened. The target had been a CIA asset, who had gone dark while gathering intelligence on weapons trafficking networks that stretched from Afghan poppy fields to European terrorist cells. The asset had been captured by a Taliban faction known for torturing prisoners to death as entertainment, and conventional rescue operations were impossible due to the political implications of acknowledging American intelligence operations in that particular region. Agent Blackbird had been inserted under deep cover, posing as a European engineering contractor working on infrastructure projects. His cover was so complete that it included fake employment records, fabricated educational credentials, and a background story that would survive investigation by hostile intelligence services. The mission parameters were brutal in their simplicity. Locate the missing asset, extract him alive if possible, recover any intelligence he had gathered, and escape to a safe zone without leaving evidence of American involvement. According to the file in front of him, Agent Blackbird was sitting across the table, wearing the uniform of a specialist, accepting termination for unsatisfactory performance in routine administrative duties. Harwick's hands began to shake as the implications settled into his mind like pieces of a puzzle that revealed a picture he hadn't expected to see. The quiet clerk who filed reports and managed supply inventories had once spent 72 hours behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence that prevented multiple terrorist attacks on American soil. The operational details were stark. The missing CIA asset was being held in a fortified compound in the tribal regions, an area so hostile that even special operations forces avoided it unless absolutely necessary. The compound was surrounded by minefields, protected by veteran fighters who had been killing American soldiers for decades, and located in terrain that offered no concealment for approaching forces. Pike had made contact with local informants through a network of relationships that took weeks to develop. He'd tracked the missing asset to the Taliban stronghold, confirmed that the man was still alive, but being systematically tortured for information that could compromise ongoing American operations throughout the region. Rather than aborting the mission when the risks became clear, Pike had developed an improvised infiltration plan that exploited a religious celebration when security would be focused on external threats rather than internal monitoring. The assault had been conducted with surgical precision that defied belief. Pike had infiltrated the compound during evening prayers, when most of the fighters were occupied with religious observances. Using suppressed weapons and close-quarters combat techniques that left no evidence of struggle, he had systematically eliminated 17 enemy combatants while making his way to the detention area where the CIA asset was being held. The extraction had been even more remarkable. The CIA asset was barely alive, having been tortured to the point where he couldn't walk unassisted. Pike had carried the man through hostile territory for 12 hours, avoiding patrols and checkpoints while making his way to an extraction point that had been compromised by enemy forces. When he arrived to find Taliban fighters waiting in ambush, Pike had improvised an alternative escape route that required crossing a river system under fire while carrying a wounded man. The intelligence recovered during Operation Nightfall had been so valuable that it was immediately classified at the highest levels and distributed only to officials with presidential-level clearance. The information had led to the disruption of 3 terrorist cells planning coordinated attacks on American airports, the identification of weapons trafficking routes that connected Afghan production facilities to European distribution networks, and the capture of a high-ranking al-Qaeda financier who had been operating under diplomatic immunity. One more detail mattered, but the file contained more than just Operation Nightfall. Pike's record revealed a pattern of high-risk assignments that had taken him to every conflict zone where American interests were threatened by enemies who couldn't be engaged through conventional military operations. Syria, where he had spent 6 months infiltrating chemical weapons facilities to document Assad regime violations of international law. Somalia, where he had tracked al-Shabaab leadership through territory so dangerous that most intelligence agencies had written it off as inaccessible. Yemen, Pakistan, Libya, places where American military personnel weren't supposed to exist, conducting operations that would never be acknowledged by any government, but which protected American lives and interests in ways that couldn't be measured by conventional metrics. Each mission had been successful, but success had come at a psychological cost that accumulated over time, like radiation exposure, invisible but ultimately devastating to human mental health. Pike had seen things that most people couldn't imagine, had made decisions that required compartmentalizing humanity in favor of mission objectives, had survived situations where the margin between life and death was measured in split-second decisions and precise application of lethal force. He had operated in environments where trust was a luxury that could get you killed, where every human interaction was potentially a threat to be neutralized, where the psychological pressure of constant vigilance left permanent marks on personality and behavior. The human mind wasn't designed to process that level of stress repeatedly without consequences. Military psychiatrists had documented the psychological toll of extended exposure to life-threatening situations. But Pike's case was extreme even by special operations standards. He had spent 5 years operating in conditions that would break most people within months, maintaining covers that required suppressing his own identity, while living among people who would kill him if they discovered his true purpose. The psychological evaluation that had led to his administrative assignment was a masterpiece of clinical understatement. Pike was suffering from what military psychiatrists carefully termed severe operational stress reaction, the kind of psychological damage that came from spending too much time in places where death was a constant companion and moral certainty was a luxury that couldn't be afforded. The recommendation had been unambiguous: extended recovery time in a low-stress environment, with minimal responsibility and maximum opportunity for psychological healing. But there was something he didn't know yet. The administrative assignment at Fort Liberty hadn't been a dead-end posting for an unremarkable soldier. It had been therapeutic placement for someone whose mind needed time to process experiences that left permanent scars on the psyche. The boring routine, the lack of challenging assignments, the absence of high-stakes decisions, all of it had been carefully designed to provide the psychological equivalent of a recovery ward for someone whose nervous system had been shattered by years of operating in situations where mistake meant death. The mediocre performance reviews that had justified Pike's termination hadn't been accurate assessments of his capabilities. They had been carefully crafted cover stories designed to ensure that he remained invisible while he recovered. His supervisors had been briefed to treat him as an ordinary clerk, to avoid assigning him tasks that might trigger psychological responses, and to maintain the fiction that he was simply another bureaucratic placeholder filling a routine position. Every aspect of Pike's administrative career had been theater designed to provide psychological sanctuary. The boring assignments that seemed to waste his talents were actually protecting his mental health. The lack of recognition that appeared to demonstrate his mediocrity was actually preserving his anonymity from enemies who might still be hunting for Agent Blackbird. The routine that seemed to indicate lack of ambition was actually providing the stability necessary for psychological recovery from trauma that couldn't be discussed in conventional therapeutic settings. General Harwick closed the file and looked around the room. Stevens and Martinez were still focused on their paperwork, unaware that they were participating in what might be the most significant intelligence breach in the history of bureaucratic incompetence. They were about to discharge a man whose operational knowledge was so sensitive that his mere existence was classified information, whose skills were so valuable that his training had cost more than most people would earn in their entire careers. Someone in the administrative chain had catastrophically failed to recognize that Pike's personnel file contained information requiring special handling. The algorithms that identified him for termination had processed only his surface record, completely missing the classified addendum that revealed his true value to national security. It was a perfect example of how bureaucratic efficiency could conflict with operational security in ways that threatened irreplaceable strategic assets. Another point troubled Harwick. Pike hadn't fought the termination, hadn't mentioned his background, hadn't pulled strings, hadn't even hinted that there might be more to his story than appeared in his standard service record. He had been prepared to walk away from his career, to disappear into civilian life, rather than reveal information that might compromise ongoing operations or endanger other personnel who were currently operating under similar covers. The kind of loyalty Pike had demonstrated couldn't be taught in training programs or developed through motivational speeches. It was forged in situations where the wrong decision could result in the deaths of fellow operators, where maintaining operational security was literally a matter of life and death, where personal sacrifice was simply another tool used to accomplish mission objectives. Pike understood that some responsibilities transcended personal comfort, career advancement, or even basic fairness. His willingness to accept termination rather than reveal classified information spoke to a level of professional discipline that was rare even among elite military personnel. Most soldiers, faced with unfair treatment, would at least hint at their true qualifications or make phone calls to contacts who could intervene on their behalf. Pike had chosen to maintain operational security even when it meant personal destruction, demonstrating the kind of integrity that couldn't be faked or manufactured through training programs. The silence in the room had stretched beyond comfort when Stevens finally looked up from his papers. He noticed Harwick's expression and the way the general's attention had locked onto the open file, like a man staring at evidence of his own incompetence. Something in Harwick's face had changed. The bureaucratic confidence had been replaced by something that looked like shock, mixed with professional concern, and a growing understanding that this routine meeting had just become something much more significant. Harwick's response came slowly, each word carefully chosen as if he were navigating through a minefield of classified information. He asked Pike to wait outside while they clarified some administrative details that required private discussion among the reviewing officials. Pike stood with the fluid motion of someone whose body had been trained for efficiency under stress. No wasted movement, no unnecessary adjustment of uniform or papers, no sign of curiosity about the sudden change in procedure. He walked to the door with the same neutral expression he'd maintained throughout the meeting, but as his hand touched the doorknob, he paused and looked back at Harwick. It wasn't a question or a plea, just acknowledgement that whatever happened next was beyond his control. The look lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but in that brief moment Harwick saw something in Pike's eyes that confirmed everything he'd just read. The controlled alertness of someone who had learned to assess threats automatically, who had survived in environments where inattention meant death. The phone calls would change the afternoon. The door closed behind Pike with the soft click of administrative finality, leaving 3 men in a room that suddenly felt much smaller than it had moments before. When Pike had gone, Harwick turned to Stevens and Martinez with the expression of someone who had just discovered that reality was more complicated than he had assumed. The words he needed to say felt like they belonged in a different universe than the one they'd been occupying for the past hour. The man they were about to discharge was not who they thought he was. The termination needed to be suspended immediately pending review by officials whose clearance level was significantly higher than anyone currently in the room. Stevens frowned, confused by the sudden change in direction, pointing out that Pike's record showed 3 years of average performance and that budget requirements clearly indicated the need for personnel reduction in administrative positions. Harwick's voice carried the tone of command that made subordinates pay attention without asking questions. He needed them to stop talking and listen very carefully to what he was about to tell them. What they had nearly done was make a mistake that would have required explanation to people who didn't accept budget cuts as adequate justification for strategic disasters that could compromise ongoing operations and endanger American personnel in hostile territories. Today, efficiency nearly made him a traitor. Martinez looked bewildered, asking if there had been some kind of administrative error in Pike's file. Harwick almost laughed, but the situation was too serious for humor. Administrative error was like calling a nuclear accident a paperwork mistake. Technically accurate, but missing the scale of the problem they had almost created. What they had nearly done was terminate a strategic asset whose operational knowledge was so sensitive that his existence was classified at levels that required presidential notification. The phone calls that followed took 45 minutes and required navigating through layers of security protocols that most military personnel never encountered in their entire careers. Harwick had to verify his identity multiple times, using codes that he hadn't accessed in years, explain the situation to officials who dealt with problems that didn't appear in standard military manuals, and justify why he was calling secure numbers that were reserved for genuine national security emergencies. A knock at the door cut across the silence. The conversation that mattered most was with someone whose title couldn't be spoken aloud in non-secure environments, someone who knew exactly who Raymond Pike was and why his cover assignment had been necessary for national security purposes. The voice on the other end of the secure line carried the weight of authority that came from dealing with situations where intelligence operations intersected with human psychology in ways that required extraordinary discretion and careful management of strategic assets. When Harwick finally hung up the phone, he understood that he'd been operating with information that was incomplete by design. Pike's administrative assignment hadn't been a holding pattern or a waste of talent. It had been active camouflage designed to keep a high-value asset invisible while he recovered from operations that had left psychological scars requiring specialized treatment that couldn't be provided through conventional military medical channels. The system had worked perfectly until budget algorithms identified him for termination based on cover stories that were never meant to survive close scrutiny by officials with sufficient clearance to access his complete record. It was a perfect example of how different parts of the military bureaucracy could work at cross purposes when security compartmentalization prevented complete information sharing between administrative and operational departments. Stevens and Martinez were dismissed with instructions that bordered on threats about discussing the afternoon's events with anyone who didn't have explicit clearance to access information about Pike's true status. They left with the confused expressions of men who'd walked into what they thought was a simple meeting and discovered they'd been operating in a world with rules they didn't understand and consequences they couldn't imagine. Their security clearances were sufficient for routine administrative work, but not for the kind of information that lived in the spaces between official records, where people like Raymond Pike existed in carefully maintained covers that protected both them and the operations they had conducted. They would spend the rest of their careers wondering what had really happened in Conference Room 3, but they would never be told the truth about what they had almost done. Pike returned to find only Harwick waiting. The termination paperwork had been replaced by new assignment orders, not a promotion or commendation, but a transfer to a position that would make better use of his particular skill set while ensuring that his capabilities wouldn't be accidentally discarded through routine administrative processes. The kind of assignment that came with clearance levels sufficient to prevent future bureaucratic confusion. Pike accepted the orders without visible reaction, but something in his posture relaxed slightly. The subtle adjustment of someone who no longer had to carry the weight of pretending to be less than he was. The psychological burden of maintaining cover for 3 years had been considerable, requiring him to accept criticism for deliberately mediocre performance, to watch colleagues advance while he remained static, to suppress every instinct that had kept him alive in hostile territories. Harwick asked the question that had been bothering him since reading the classified file. Why hadn't Pike mentioned his background when he realized what the meeting was about? He could have made a single phone call that would have stopped the termination process immediately. Pike considered the question with the same careful neutrality he'd maintained throughout the afternoon, choosing his words as if they were being recorded for future analysis. His previous operations required maintaining cover even when that cover became personally costly. Breaking operational security without explicit authorization would have been inconsistent with mission requirements, regardless of personal consequences. It was exactly the answer Harwick had expected from someone who understood that some responsibilities transcended individual comfort. Pike had been prepared to sacrifice his career rather than compromise operational security that protected other personnel currently operating under similar covers. As Pike left with his new assignment orders, Harwick remained at the table, contemplating the implications of what had almost happened. The military was a machine designed to manage large numbers of people efficiently, but machines sometimes missed details that mattered more than efficiency. Today, the system had nearly discarded someone whose value couldn't be measured in standard metrics, whose very existence represented capabilities that couldn't be replaced through conventional training programs. 3 weeks later, Pike reported to his new assignment. The details were classified, but it involved work that utilized skills he'd developed in places that didn't appear on official maps, applying lessons learned in environments where failure meant death to problems that required solutions conventional military assets couldn't provide. His new supervisor understood what those skills meant and how they could be employed in ways that balanced mission requirements with long-term psychological sustainability. The psychological evaluation accompanying his transfer indicated that his recovery was complete and that he was ready to return to operational status in a capacity that would challenge his abilities without exposing him to the level of stress that had required his administrative sabbatical. The 3 years of routine work had served their purpose, allowing his nervous system to recover from the hypervigilance that had kept him alive in hostile territories, but which was incompatible with normal social functioning. The clerical position at Fort Liberty was filled by someone whose background was actually suited to filing reports and managing inventory, someone who would never have to worry about maintaining cover stories or managing psychological recovery from operations that officially hadn't happened. The replacement was competent, reliable, and thoroughly unremarkable, exactly what the position required and what Pike had been forced to pretend to be for 3 years, while his mind healed from trauma that couldn't be discussed in standard therapeutic settings. Harwick kept Pike's original file in his personal safe as a reminder of how close the system had come to discarding something irreplaceable. The case became a teaching tool for training other administrators about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances when making personnel decisions that could have strategic implications extending far beyond budget management and routine administration. He placed the file in the safe and set an old challenge coin engraved "Integrity" on the cover. Months later, when reviewing personnel files for other budget-related decisions, Harwick found himself examining details that lived between the lines. Classification markers that might indicate hidden depths, medical records suggesting experiences beyond standard service, training certifications that seemed inconsistent with current assignments. He was looking for other Raymond Pikes who might be hiding in plain sight, protected by covers that made them appear ordinary until someone with sufficient clearance looked closely enough to see the truth. The administrative changes resulting from Pike's near termination were subtle but significant. New protocols required additional verification before budget-driven terminations of personnel with any level of security clearance, ensuring that classified personnel wouldn't be accidentally released through routine administrative processes. Training programs educated administrative staff about recognizing details that might seem routine but carried implications beyond their apparent scope. Most importantly, the incident served as a reminder that in organizations designed to manage large numbers of people efficiently, individual stories could contain complexities that didn't fit standard categories. Sometimes the most valuable assets were those who appeared least remarkable. And protecting those assets required understanding the difference between what could be written in official records and what mattered in the spaces where real work was done to protect national security interests. 6 months after Pike's reassignment, Harwick received a phone call beginning with a simple statement. The operation was successful. No details, no elaboration, just confirmation that someone whose skills had nearly been discarded through administrative oversight had completed a mission significant enough to warrant notification at the general's clearance level. The call lasted less than 30 seconds, but it confirmed that Pike's reassignment had been crucial to protecting American interests in ways that would never appear in official reports. Harwick never learned specifics of what Pike accomplished in his new assignment. The details existed in classification levels designed to ensure that certain information never appeared in systems accessible through standard administrative channels, but he understood that the quiet man who had sat in Conference Room 3, accepting termination with dignity rather than compromising operational security, had gone on to perform work that justified every dollar spent on his training and every administrative complication created by maintaining his cover. The lesson stayed with Harwick throughout his remaining career. In organizations built around managing large numbers of people efficiently, the most important individuals were often those who appeared least important until circumstances revealed their true value. Protecting national security sometimes meant protecting people whose contributions couldn't be measured in standard metrics or documented in official records accessible to routine administrative review, and that sometimes the most critical decision a leader could make was recognizing when to look beyond the information they'd been given and ask whether the story they thought they knew was actually the story that mattered. This principle applied not just to personnel management, but to any situation where surface appearances might conceal deeper truths that could have significant consequences if overlooked or misunderstood. In the end, Raymond Pike's story became a reminder that protecting national security required more than managing resources efficiently. It required understanding that some people carried capabilities too important to be lost through bureaucratic oversight, and too dangerous to be fully documented in any system designed for routine administration. The kind of story that could only be told at classification levels most people would never access, about heroes whose sacrifices could only be acknowledged by those who understood the true cost of keeping certain secrets safe.